In this video, I'm going to show you the perfect way to create a user form in Excel VBA. Creating a user form should be simple, but there are many pitfalls for the unwary. Whether it is seeing automation errors, having your user form disappear, or not knowing how to retrieve the user selections from the calling code. In the next few minutes, you will learn how to easily avoid all these issues and create a practical user form for real-world use. Let's take a look at the user form that we're going to be using. So it's a very simple user form with a drop-down that allows us to select a country. And we've got an OK button. So when we click OK, we can see which country was selected. Now this is very simple, but it's very useful because it allows us to showcase the different techniques when we're dealing with user forms. So let's go ahead and get started creating this user form. To create a user form, we right-click on the workbook in the project window. And then we select Insert and User Form. And that creates a new empty user form. You can see the toolbox on the left-hand side here. And this allows us to place controls on our user form. If it's not visible, you can select View and Toolbox from the menu. Or you can do Alt-V-X. Now if we want to add a control, we simply select the control like this until it's highlighted. And when we move the cursor onto the user form, you can see that we have a plus for the cursor. So we simply hold down the left mouse key and just drag it where we want to place it. And you can see that it created a button. So once we release it, the control is created. So to create a combo box, we do the same thing. Select the combo box, we see the plus, and we just drag it where we want it. Now once we have controls, we want to configure the properties. So you can see the properties window in the left hand side here has all the properties of the combo box. Now we're going to pop it out here by double clicking on it so that it's floating and that we can easily use it. So in the combo box, we often want to change properties like the name. So we'd say combo box and we'll call it country. And I'm going to change the font just to make it easier to see on the screen. So we'd set the font to 12. Now command button is the same. We're just going to change the name of it to button OK. So that's going to be our OK button. And what we do then is we use the caption, and the caption is going to be OK. And then we use O as the accelerator. So what that means is that O is underlined here. This means when the user form is running, we can access the OK button by selecting All plus O. So this is our user form with our basic controls on it. Now if we select user form as well, we can change the user form name to user form country. And then we can set the caption. So the caption is what appears in the blue bar at the top. So for example, I can say something like select country. And you can see that it appears in the title bar. If at any point then we want to test our user form, we can simply run it from here. Or press F5. And you can see that it comes up. Now to view the code on the user form, we press F7. And we can press Shift F7 to go back to the user form. So F7 and Shift F7 to switch between them. And you can see when we enter the code, by default it has a user form click. It has this by default, but we can delete it. If we go back to the user form, so if we go back to the user form like this, we can select the button click event by double clicking on the button. If we double click on the combo box, it creates the combo box change event. This method is really useful for quickly creating the common events. If you wish to create the other events for a control, then use the left drop down to select that control. If we select a control from the left drop down and that control does not have any events, then VBA automatically creates the main event for that control. So for example, if I select button OK, it selects the button OK click event. Now once button OK is selected in the left hand side, we can click on the right hand side and that gives us a list of all the different events for that control. So for example, we could select double click here and double click will be created. Now if we want to create the initialize user form event, we select user form here and you can see it automatically created the user form click event. But this is not the one we want, so we go back to our drop down on the right and we select initialize. And then we can get rid of this one. Now once we have the initialize, what we want to do is we want to fill our combo box when the user form is created. So we do combo and we do list. and we can assign this to any array and it will fill it to the combo box. Now we have a list of countries on sheet 1. So what we can do is we can say sheet 1, and when I say sheet 1 here, I'm referring to the code name, which you can see on the left hand side in our project window. And then I select the range and A1, and I use current region to return me all the items in that list. And then we select value to return the array from that range. And that will fill our combo box. The next thing we want to do is we want to assign it to one of the values. So we want to have one value selected. So we use list index. Now list index starts at 0. So it goes from 0. So we assign it to 0, we'll pick the first item. We assign it to 1, it picks the second, and so on. But generally speaking, you're going to assign it to 0. Now if we want to test our user form, we can just run it from here by selecting run, like this. So run sub user form, or pressing F5. And you can see that our user form appears. We've got Australia selected, and we've got a list of all the countries. Now typically on a user form, we would have an OK and cancel button. So let's add our cancel button. Now our properties window, you see it's not there. Well, we can actually make that appear by simply pressing F4, or we can go to view properties window, which is here. Now the cancel button is just like other buttons, but it has one little difference. So let's just put the name of it first. We'll say button cancel. Our accelerator is going to be C, and the caption is going to be obviously cancel. Now the one difference that this has is there is a property here called cancel. And if we set this property to true, what it means is that when our user form is running, if we press the escape key, it will actually run what is in cancel. So whatever is in the cancel event. So to create the cancel event, we just click here. And now we've got the cancel event. Now this is very important, what I'm going to say next. Often when you see code about the user form, if you read an article or see lots of videos, they often say at this point you should unload the user form. And what this does is it kicks it out of memory. Now this is a really bad idea because often we want the caller to reference the user form later, and if we've kicked it out of memory and destroyed it, then we can't do this. So what we do instead is hide it, and we can leave it up to the caller then to unload it at some point in the future. So we want to hide, and also when the OK click button is selected, we want to hide as well. If the user selects OK, then we want the calling code to be able to access the country that was selected. And if the user selects cancel, we want the calling code to know that the user form was cancelled. To allow the calling code to retrieve values back from the user form, we use what's called properties. Now to create a property, we do the following. So we select insert procedure, and then we select property, and our property's name is going to be country. So we don't need the let one. The let one is basically assigning a value, so assigning a country from outside. So we want the country property. This will allow the calling code to retrieve a value from the user form. And we return this by saying country equals and whatever selected in our combo box, and that is simply the value. And of course it's going to be a string. So now to create the calling code, we go to insert and then we create a module. And we'll just call this module main. And how we use our form is we say dim form as new user form country, and then we simply show the form. And then what we want to do is we want to get whatever was selected by the user, which is the country. So let's run this code, and we've got Australia. So let's pick a different one. We'll pick China, and we click OK, and you can see it gave us China. Now, of course, the one problem we have with this code is that if we click cancel, it still brings us up the country. So if we go back to our user form code, what we need to do is to somehow tell the calling code that the user form was cancelled. And this is actually pretty straightforward to do. It's very similar to what we did with country. We simply insert another property, and we're going to call our property cancelled. And again, we don't need the let one because we're just retrieving a value. We're not setting a value. And we're going to have a variable called m_cancelled. And we say cancelled equals whatever's in that value. and we declare that value here as a Boolean. So it's either true or false. And so on initialize, we set this to be false. So it's not cancelled. But then if we select cancel, so button cancel, then we want it to be cancelled. So we say cancelled equals true. So now if we go back to our calling code, we basically say if form.cancelled equals false, then display the country. And then when we're finished with our user form, we want to unload it. So unload form. Now we can't use the form once it's unloaded, so very important to have all our form code before this. So now if we run our code, and let's select a different country, we'll select Brazil this time. We click on cancel and nothing happens, which is what we wanted. So what we could do is we could put some code in here and we can say if the form is cancelled, then what we want to do is say form cancelled by user. And we run our code again. I click cancel, it says form cancelled by user.
If I run it again and this time click OK, it now displays Australia.
We have our form here and we decide we don't want to use this form anymore. So we click on the X, or the user clicks on the X. And what happens is we get an automation error. Now the reason that happens is because when we click on the X, it actually unloads the user form itself. And so when we're trying to access the user form, we're getting this error. Now what we can do to circumvent this is we can basically hijack that call and prevent it from occurring. So we go to the query close, so that's query close event.
We use the close mode parameter to tell us where the user form was closed from. Now VB form control menu means it was closed by the X. So if it has been closed by the X, we want to set cancel to true.
And so what this means is that
it will cancel the current close operation.
And what we want to do then is the same as before. We want to use cancelled and hide. So we're going to create our own cancel sub. So let's take this code and we're going to say private sub cancel form. And then this will have the cancel equal true and the hide. And we'll just call this from here. And we'll also call it from our query close. So basically our query close is stopping the terminate process. So stopping the window terminate process, it's instead cancelling the form. So let's go back to our calling code and we run the calling code. And now if I click X, it says the form cancelled by the user. Now we've got one small problem left with our code. And the problem is that we're directly accessing the worksheet from the user form. And this is something that we don't want to do. The reason we don't want to do it is as follows. For good software design, what we want to do is we want to provide settings to the user form when we load it. So settings come in the form of properties. We set the properties. Then the user makes some kind of selection and then we retrieve the user selection to the calling code. And again, that's done through the use of properties. So what bad software design would look like is when the user form is randomly accessing different parts of our application. So it might be accessing the database, it might be accessing the worksheet. So this causes problems if we change where our data is stored or how it's stored. It means that we have to make lots of changes to the user form. And really we only want to be making changes at the data layer. So how do we write our code to follow good design practices? So if we go back here, what we want to have instead of this is we want to have a member variable. We add the member variable countries, and this is going to store our list. And then we add a let property. The let property allows us to pass a value from the calling code to the user form, whereas the get property retrieves a value from the user form and brings it back to the calling code. We'll use this to pass countries from the calling code into our user form. This will assign it to the variable, and then down here we will set the value. So what we do is we say countries equals get countries, and get countries is our function. Now you might say, why am I using a function? Why don't I directly access the worksheet? And the reason is that if in the future how we get the data changes, we read from a database, from a file, or it's just a different way of getting it from a worksheet, then we only got to make the change in this function. We don't have to make any changes to our user form and our code will still work fine. So we've assigned countries and we're going to show the user form. Now this little bit is tricky, but there is a solution. The problem is when we assign the let property, it actually triggers the initialize event first. So the initialize will run before we've actually assigned the countries. So in other words, we run the code, it'll say cannot set the list property, invalid property array. And the reason this error happened is because it's running initialize before it's actually setting the property of the countries. So how do we get around this? So the way we get around it is quite simply we use the activate instead of initialize. Now the difference between activate is activate occurs when the worksheet actually appears and initialize is when the worksheet is created. Now activate can happen multiple times. So in other words, if we hide the worksheet and we bring it back again, then that triggers activate. So for that reason, we need to put an if statement in so that we don't keep refilling. So we basically say if list count equals 0, then fill our combo box. Otherwise, we don't do anything. Now, if we go back to our calling code and run the code, you'll see that it worked perfectly. We can select the country and it says Brazil. Now, you might be thinking this is a lot to remember when you're creating a user form, and you'd be right, it is a lot to remember, but you don't need to do that. What you can do is just simply use this code as a template. So if you go to the description below this video, you can download this code. And then any time that you're creating a user form in your application, just use this user form as a template. There are two types of user form behavior in VBA. There's modal and modelless. So modal is the one we've been looking at so far. And what it means is that when it's visible, we do not have access to Excel. In other words, it takes over the application and it continues to take over the application until we close it. Now in this case, we've got one that's not modal, or what it's called is modal-less. And so here I can click on a cell, I can then click on the user form, I can click back on the cell, click on the button, and so on. Now I cannot do this with a modal one. So let's look at the difference between them because they have some behaviors that's important to understand. To set a user form to be either modal or modal-less, we use the show modal property. Now when the show modal property is set to true, which is the default, it'll behave as a modal user form, which was in our last example. Now in this example, it's modal-less or non-modal, so we set show modal to false. Now we can also do this in the calling code. So in the show method, we can actually specify it to be modal. So I could actually make this one modal. When we run the code, you can see that we cannot select any cells. If I set the parameter to VB modalless, it'll make it modalless. Now because we've already set it in the properties, we don't need to do this. Now one very important thing to understand here is that when we use form show on a modal dialog, the code stops on this line until the dialog is closed. But modalless is different. It doesn't stop on the show. So for example, if I run this code, it actually displayed the user form. So we can see the user form is displayed, but the code continues on. It doesn't wait for it to finish. And that's because it's given control back to Excel. So with this user form, when we close it, we actually do want to unload it. But just remember, we only unload it because it's modalless or non-modal. Because once we click the close button for this type of user form, we typically don't need to retrieve the user selection. So it's very important to understand the difference between a modal and a modalless dialog. There is one major issue with using the modalless dialog. Now the solution to it is pretty simple, but it's not at all that obvious. So this is the problem that we have. When we run this code, you can see that it brings up the dialog as normal. But if we minimize Excel or we minimize this particular workbook, and then we bring it back up, the dialog is no longer visible. To solve this issue, what we do is write our calling code slightly different. So instead of using dim form as user form, we actually declare it as an object. And then we set it to be VBA.UserForms, and we use add to add the user form, and we simply use the name. And the name is user form color. And now once we have it added, we simply show it as normal. So let's run this code. Brings up the dialog as we expected. And then if we minimize it, and let's bring it back up, you can see that it remains at the front. If you would like to see a real-world example of UserForms, then check out my data entry video here.